When a 92-year-old veteran is bullied by bikers, it looks like he's just an old man who can't fight back. But then, he makes a shocking phone call that changes everything. What the bikers don't realize is that this call will bring help they never expected. The tables are about to turn, and they'll soon find out they picked the wrong man to mess with. What happens next will leave everyone stunned. Samuel Hayes stepped out of the diner, his cane tapping firmly on the pavement. Across the street, a faint rumble filled the air 2014. The sound of motorcycles approaching. The steel vipers were coming. Again. Sam adjusted his hat and turned toward his old, battered truck parked nearby. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if the threat on the horizon was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. But he wasn't naive. He knew these bikers weren't just passing through. Within moments, the street filled with noise as 7 motorcycles roared into view, their riders clad in leather and denim, faces hidden behind dark sunglasses. Dust rose behind them as they came to a halt, their engines still rumbling. The leader, Viper, swung off his bike, his heavily tattooed arms glinting in the sunlight. "Well, look who it is," Viper drawled, his voice carrying the arrogance of someone who believed he owned the world. "The town's favorite fossil." Sam didn't respond. He opened his truck door and placed his cane carefully on the passenger seat. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Grandpa," Viper shouted, striding forward. His crew chuckled behind him, enjoying the show. "Or did your hearing go with the rest of you?" Sam turned, his sharp blue eyes meeting Viper's glare. "I heard you," he said calmly. "I just didn't think it was worth responding to." The laughter from the gang stopped abruptly. One of the bikers leaned over to another and whispered, "This old guy's got guts." Viper's face twisted in irritation. "You think you're funny, huh? Let me tell you something, old man. This street, this town, it belongs to us now. You don't get to walk around acting like you own it." Sam leaned against the truck, his gaze steady and unflinching. "I've been here longer than you've been alive, boy. This town doesn't belong to you, and it never will." The gang shifted uneasily, sensing the tension building. Viper stepped closer, his massive frame towering over Sam. "Big words for someone who's one push away from breaking a hip," he snarled. "You'd be surprised how hard this old man can push back," Sam replied evenly, his voice carrying a quiet strength that made even the onlookers behind their windows sit up a little straighter. Viper smirked, though the confidence in his eyes flickered for just a moment. He turned to his crew, motioning toward Sam's truck. "Looks like Grandpa needs a reminder of who's in charge." One of the bikers stepped forward and slammed his boot into the side of Sam's truck, leaving a deep dent. Another grabbed a rock and hurled it at the windshield, cracking the glass. Still, Sam didn't move. "You better watch yourself," Viper said, leaning in close. "Next time, we won't stop at your truck." With that, he climbed back onto his bike. The gang revved their engines, the deafening noise echoing through the street as they sped off, leaving a cloud of dust and unease behind. Sam stood there for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. When the sound of the motorcycles finally faded, he climbed into his truck and started the engine. The crack in the windshield distorted his view, but his hands were steady on the wheel. As he drove home, memories of his past surfaced unbidden. The roar of motorcycles wasn't much different from the rumble of enemy tanks he'd once faced in Europe. The fear and chaos were the same, but so was the resolve. He had survived then, and he would survive now. His small house sat on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown grass and an old picket fence. It wasn't much, but it was home. Sam parked his truck and stepped inside, locking the door behind him. The quiet was almost overwhelming after the noise of the gang, but it didn't bring him peace. He made his way to the basement, the stairs creaking under his weight. In the corner of the dimly lit room was an old chest, its surface scratched and dented from years of use. He hadn't opened it in decades, but he knew what was inside. Sam knelt down, his knees protesting the movement, and ran his hand over the chest. The metal was cold under his fingers, and for a moment he hesitated. Opening this chest would mean bringing back a part of himself he'd tried to leave behind. But the steel vipers had crossed a line, and Sam knew they wouldn't stop until someone stood up to them. Slowly, he opened the chest, revealing its contents: a neatly folded uniform, a stack of yellowed letters, and a small arsenal of weapons. His old service pistol lay on top, its grip worn but still solid. Sam picked up the pistol, the weight of it familiar in his hand. He checked the chamber, his movements precise despite the years that had passed. As he held the weapon, he felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about protecting the town, the people who had become too afraid to fight back. The next morning, Sam was up before dawn. He loaded his truck with supplies from the chest, carefully wrapping each item in cloth to keep them hidden. He drove into town and parked near the diner, where the morning crowd was just starting to trickle in. The waitress from the previous day approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Hayes, are you okay? After what happened yesterday, I mean." Sam nodded. "I'm fine, Lucy. Don't worry about me." "But those bikers, they're dangerous. You should let the sheriff handle it." Sam smiled faintly. "The sheriff's got enough on his plate. Besides, I've handled worse." Lucy looked unconvinced but didn't press further. As she walked away, Sam turned his attention to the street. He knew the Steel Vipers would be back. The only question was when. By midday, the rumble of motorcycles returned, louder and more aggressive than before. This time, the gang didn't stop in the middle of the street. They rode straight to the diner, their bikes skidding to a halt just feet from Sam's truck. Viper dismounted, his expression darker than it had been the day before. "You didn't get the message, old man," he said, his voice low and menacing. Sam stepped out of the diner, his cane in one hand and a bag of groceries in the other. He placed the groceries in the truck bed before turning to face Viper. "I got your message," Sam said, "but I don't take orders from cowards." Viper's eyes narrowed. "You're really asking for it, aren't you?" Sam shrugged. "You came looking for a fight. Maybe it's time you found one." For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Viper gestured to his crew. "Teach him a lesson," he said. But as the bikers stepped forward, Sam reached into his truck and pulled out something unexpected: a military-issued smoke grenade. He pulled the pin and tossed it at their feet, the street erupting in a cloud of thick, choking smoke. The gang stumbled back, coughing and shouting in confusion. By the time the smoke cleared, Sam was gone, his truck speeding down the road. Viper stood in the middle of the street, his fists clenched and his face twisted in rage. "This isn't over!" he bellowed. But Sam wasn't listening. He had a plan, and the Steel Vipers were about to learn that some battles aren't worth picking. Samuel Hayes drove down the back roads with a steady hand, his old truck kicking up dust as the town disappeared behind him. The cracked windshield barely bothered him anymore. His focus was on the task ahead, a task he hadn't thought he'd face again, not at this age. The Steel Vipers had crossed a line, and Sam knew their type. Bullies, loud, brash, full of themselves. But under all that swagger was fear, the fear of someone standing up to them. He had seen it countless times in the war, in the faces of young soldiers who thought their bravado could shield them from the terror of battle. As he rounded a bend, Sam's thoughts drifted to a different road, decades earlier, where the roar of engines had been replaced by the clatter of boots and the whistle of incoming artillery. The smells of diesel fuel, gunpowder, and earth had been his constant companions. Those memories, though buried deep, came back as sharp as a blade. Sam pulled off onto a dirt trail leading to an abandoned barn. It had been years since he'd visited this place, but the sturdy structure still stood, weathered but reliable. He parked the truck and climbed out, his movements slower but no less deliberate. Opening the barn doors, he was greeted by the scent of hay and wood, a far cry from the battlefields of Europe but comforting in its own way. In the corner of the barn was a second chest, larger and heavier than the one in his basement. He dragged it out, the metal scraping against the wooden floor. Unlocking it, he revealed its contents: maps, binoculars, field radios, and more weapons than most people would know what to do with. Among them was an M1 Garand, the same type of rifle he had carried during the war. It was in pristine condition, cleaned and oiled as if it were waiting for this moment. Sam picked up the rifle and held it against his shoulder, testing the weight. Muscle memory kicked in, and he felt the old discipline return like slipping into a familiar coat. "Looks like we've got work to do," he muttered to himself. Back at his house that evening, Sam sat at the kitchen table, sorting through a pile of yellowed papers. These were old field notes, plans he and his platoon had used during their missions. Many of them were irrelevant now, but the principles were the same. Understand your enemy, anticipate their moves, and strike where they least expect it. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, recognizing the number immediately. It was a contact he hadn't spoken to in decades. "About time you called," the voice on the other end said. "Figured I'd need the cavalry for this one," Sam replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You're really stirring things up over there, aren't you?" "Something like that. Can you get the boys together?" There was a pause, followed by a chuckle. "At our age, you're lucky we're all still breathing. But yeah, I can make a few calls. What's the plan?" "I'll explain when you get here. Just be ready for trouble." Sam hung up and leaned back in his chair. The thought of seeing his old comrades again filled him with equal parts excitement and apprehension. They were all older now, slower, and carrying their own burdens. But if there was one thing Sam knew, it was that age hadn't dulled their loyalty. The next morning, Sam got to work preparing his property. He started with the perimeter, setting up tripwires connected to noisemakers, empty cans strung together to create a racket if someone crossed the line. He reinforced his doors and windows with heavy wooden planks and cleared a path to the basement, where he could retreat if things got out of hand. By midday, he heard the rumble of a vehicle approaching. It wasn't the Steel Vipers this time, but a beat-up van that came to a halt in his driveway. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a wiry man with a salt-and-pepper beard and a sharp glint in his eye. "Still living in the middle of nowhere, huh, Sam?" the man said, grinning as he walked up. "Figured it was quieter this way, Charlie," Sam replied, shaking his hand firmly. Charlie wasn't alone. 4 more men climbed out of the van, each one carrying the weight of years on their faces but moving with the confidence of people who had faced death and lived to tell the tale. "Look at you, Sam," said one of them, a burly man with a limp. "Still thinking you're 25. "Look who's talking, Frank," Sam shot back, smirking. They gathered around the kitchen table, where Sam spread out a map of the town. He marked key locations, including the diner, the Steel Vipers' known hangouts, and their suspected hideout on the outskirts of town. "Their leader, Viper, is the one we need to neutralize," Sam explained. "Take him out of the equation, and the rest will scatter like roaches." "You sure about this, Sam?" Charlie asked, leaning forward. "We're not exactly in fighting shape anymore." "We don't have to be," Sam replied. "We just need to be smarter than them, and I've got a plan for that." That night, the group worked in silence, setting traps and creating diversions around town. Sam had called in a few favors with some of the braver locals who agreed to help in small ways, blocking off roads or spreading misinformation to confuse the gang. By the time dawn broke, the town was a fortress in disguise. Sam stood on his porch, the morning air crisp and quiet. He felt a strange sense of calm, knowing what was coming. The peace didn't last long. Around mid-morning, the roar of motorcycles shattered the stillness. The Steel Vipers had returned, this time with even more riders in tow. They tore down the main street, their leader barking orders as they stopped in front of the diner. "Where's the old man?" Viper shouted, his voice echoing off the buildings. Sam stepped out onto the street, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Behind him, his comrades emerged from the shadows, their weapons at the ready. "You were looking for me?" Sam called out, his tone calm but firm. The sight of the group seemed to catch the bikers off guard. For a moment there was silence as both sides sized each other up. Then Viper laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "This is your army," he said, gesturing to the aging men behind Sam. "A bunch of grandpas with guns?" Sam smiled faintly. "Maybe, but let's see how far your boys get against grandpas who know what they're doing." Before Viper could respond, the first trap was triggered. A deafening bang erupted as a smoke grenade went off, engulfing the bikers in a thick cloud. Confusion spread through their ranks, and Sam's team moved quickly, executing their plan with military precision. The faint scent of gasoline and burnt rubber lingered in the air long after the steel Vipers sped off, leaving a cloud of tension behind them. Sam stood on his porch, his eyes scanning the street for signs of movement. The uneasy silence that followed their departure was almost worse than the gang's noisy arrival. The way they left so quickly, without trying to escalate further, was uncharacteristic. It wasn't fear, it was planning. Inside, the house felt too quiet. Sam closed the door, bolted it, and moved to his kitchen table, where his battered notebook sat open. Scribbled across its pages were notes, tactics, and reminders of strategies he had used in the past. His hand lingered over an old photo tucked between the pages, a black and white snapshot of his unit from the war. Their young faces stared back at him, unmarked by time or tragedy. "Still got some fight left in me," he muttered, as if speaking to them. Just as he flipped to the next page, the sharp ring of the phone broke the silence. Sam grabbed it, already expecting the voice on the other end. "Sam," Charlie's voice came through, low and urgent. "Got some news. One of the townsfolk overheard the Vipers talking at the gas station. They're planning something big." "Did they say what?" Sam asked, his tone clipped. "No, but they were mentioning your name. Sounds like they're aiming to make an example out of you." Sam leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. "Let them try," he said quietly, "but I'm not going down without a fight." "You sure you don't want to get out of there, Sam? This isn't just a couple of punks breaking windows anymore. They're out for blood." "Running isn't my style, Charlie," Sam said. "We faced worse, haven't we?" Charlie hesitated before letting out a soft chuckle. "Yeah, we have. All right, I'll rally the boys. We'll be ready." That evening, Sam walked the perimeter of his property, checking the makeshift defenses he had installed earlier. Tripwires, noisemakers, reinforced barriers. It was all rudimentary, but it would buy him time if the Vipers came calling. His mind raced with possibilities. Viper wasn't just angry. He was humiliated. The smoke grenade Sam had used earlier had been a message, and Sam knew men like Viper couldn't handle being outsmarted. Their bruised egos always demanded payback, and they never came alone. As night fell, Sam sat on his porch with his rifle resting across his lap. The quiet of the town was deceptive, like the calm before a storm. He thought of the townsfolk, the ones who had avoided him for fear of getting on the Viper's bad side. He didn't blame them. They were just ordinary people trying to survive, not soldiers trained to fight battles. But he wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for them, too. Around midnight, the faint hum of engines broke the stillness. Sam tensed, his grip tightening on the rifle. He turned off the porch light and moved to the shadows, peering down the road. Sure enough, the Vipers were coming. Their headlights cut through the darkness as they approached in a tight formation, their numbers larger than before. Sam counted at least 15 riders this time. The odds weren't good, but he'd faced worse. He slipped back inside, locking the door behind him, and made his way to the basement. From a hidden compartment, he retrieved a pair of radios and a small earpiece. He placed the earpiece in his ear and adjusted the frequency, his voice low but steady as he spoke. "They're here," he said. "Roger that." Charlie's voice crackled in response. A few streets away, Charlie and the other veterans were waiting in position. Each of them had a role to play, and each was armed with the tools of their trade. These weren't just old men, they were tacticians, engineers, and sharpshooters, all with decades of experience under their belts. The Vipers parked their bikes in front of Sam's house, their engines rumbling as they dismounted. Viper himself led the way, a crowbar resting casually on his shoulder. "All right, old man," Viper shouted, his voice carrying through the night. "Come out and face us. Or are you too scared to fight without your smoke tricks?" Inside, Sam didn't respond. He watched from the window as the gang spread out, some moving toward the house while others circled back toward the yard. "Let's give them a proper welcome," Sam whispered into the radio. The first trap was triggered near the side of the house. One of the bikers tripped a wire, setting off a loud metallic clatter as cans and bells crashed together. The noise startled the group, drawing their attention. "Idiots!" Viper snarled. "Stay focused." But before they could regroup, the second trap went off. A floodlight hidden in a tree switched on, illuminating the yard and blinding the gang momentarily. From the shadows, Sam and his team moved into action. Charlie fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the rifle echoing through the night. "Get off my property!" Sam called out, his voice firm and commanding. The gang hesitated, their confidence faltering as they realized they weren't just dealing with one old man. Viper growled, swinging his crowbar into a nearby fence. "You think a few tricks are going to stop us?" Sam stepped out onto the porch, his rifle aimed squarely at Viper. Behind him, Charlie and the others emerged, their weapons at the ready. "This is your only warning," Sam said. "Turn around and leave, or you won't make it out of here." For a moment, the street was silent. Then, one of the younger bikers panicked and fired his pistol wildly into the air. The sound sent the gang into chaos, and Sam's team seized the opportunity. In the ensuing minutes, the veterans demonstrated why they had once been among the best. They moved with precision, using the traps and the terrain to their advantage. A biker trying to climb the fence found himself tangled in barbed wire. Another stepped into a hidden pit, falling with a yelp. Viper, however, refused to back down. He charged toward the house, crowbar in hand, his eyes filled with rage. Sam met him head-on, his rifle still aimed. "Drop it," he said. Viper sneered. "You don't have the guts." Sam's finger hovered over the trigger, but before he could fire, a sharp crack echoed from behind him. Charlie had taken the shot, the bullet grazing Viper's arm and sending the crowbar clattering to the ground. The gang leader stumbled back, clutching his arm, his bravado finally cracking. "This isn't over!" he shouted, retreating to his bike. As the gang fled, Sam and his team stood their ground, watching until the motorcycles were nothing but distant noise. Back inside, Sam lowered his rifle and exhaled deeply. Charlie clapped him on the shoulder. "Still got it, huh?" "For now," Sam replied with a small smile, but as he sat down at the kitchen table, his thoughts turned to the future. The Vipers might have retreated tonight, but Sam knew this wasn't the end. They would regroup, and next time they'd come back stronger, and when they did, Sam would be ready. The aftermath of the standoff left the small town eerily quiet. Samuel Hayes sat at his kitchen table cleaning his rifle with slow, practiced movements. The acrid smell of gun oil filled the room, but it didn't bother him. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the Steel Vipers and the trouble they were bound to bring next. The gang hadn't taken their defeat lightly. Sam knew men like Viper. They didn't lick their wounds and move on. They came back, harder and meaner. This wasn't over. Charlie entered the kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. His salt and pepper beard twitched as he took a sip, eyeing Sam carefully. "You're thinking too much," he said, breaking the silence. "Just trying to stay ahead," Sam replied without looking up. Charlie grunted. "Ahead of what? A gang of overgrown kids on motorcycles? They're bullies, Sam, nothing more." "They're organized bullies," Sam corrected. "And organized bullies can do a lot of damage if they're not stopped. They'll be back, and next time they'll bring more than crowbars and pistols." Charlie leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "Then maybe we should bring more too." Sam paused, his hands stilling on the rifle. He glanced at Charlie, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly. "You have someone in mind?" Charlie grinned, the kind of grin that meant trouble, but the good kind. "You remember Big John? John Langston?" Sam asked, leaning back in his chair. "Haven't seen him in years. Thought he moved to Florida." "He did," Charlie said. "But last I heard, he's back up north. Still has a soft spot for the old crew. And if you're looking for reinforcements, he's the guy you want. Nobody handles explosives like Big John." Sam nodded slowly, the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. "All right, make the call." The next day, the small town woke to a sense of uneasy anticipation. Word of the confrontation between Sam and the Steel Vipers had spread, and though no one said it out loud, everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sam spent the morning reinforcing his defenses. He added more tripwires around the property and buried a few surprises in the yard. Nothing lethal, but enough to dissuade any unwelcome visitors. Meanwhile, Charlie made his calls, his voice low and urgent as he reached out to their old comrades. By midday, the first of them arrived. Big John Langston pulled up in a battered pickup truck, his large frame barely contained by the driver's seat. He stepped out with a booming laugh, his deep voice echoing across the yard. "Sam Hayes, you old devil! Still causing trouble, I see." Sam smiled faintly as he walked over, extending a hand. "Good to see you, John." John clasped Sam's hand in both of his own, his grip firm. "Charlie told me what's going on. Sounds like you've got quite the mess on your hands." "Nothing we can't handle," Sam replied. "That's the spirit," John said, clapping Sam on the back. "I brought some supplies. Figured you might need a little extra firepower." The supplies in question turned out to be a collection of tools and materials that only someone with John's expertise could procure. Everything from smoke bombs to improvised flashbangs. "Hope you've still got steady hands," John joked as he unloaded the gear. "I've got steady enough hands to keep you in line," Sam shot back, drawing a laugh from both men. By evening, 2 more of their old comrades had joined the group. Marcus "Sly" Sylvester, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a talent for infiltration, and Carl Peterson, a former medic who could patch up anything from a sprained ankle to a gunshot wound. The group gathered in Sam's living room, the atmosphere tense but determined. A map of the town was spread across the coffee table, marked with notes and diagrams. Sam tapped the map with a pencil, his voice firm. "We know the Steel Vipers are going to retaliate. It's just a matter of when and how. Our goal is to stop them before they can do any real damage. That means taking the fight to them." "What's the plan?" Sly asked, his eyes flicking between the map and Sam's face. "We hit their hideout," Sam said. "It's an old warehouse on the edge of town. They've been using it as a base of operations. We go in, disable their bikes, and take out their supplies. No bikes, no gang." John nodded approvingly. "Smart. Take away their mobility, and they're nothing." "What about the people in town?" Carl asked. "If we hit the Vipers, they might retaliate against the locals." Sam's jaw tightened. "That's why we need to be fast and decisive. We hit them hard, and we make sure they know coming back isn't an option." The room fell silent for a moment, each man considering the weight of what lay ahead. Then Charlie spoke up, his voice steady. "We've done harder things. We can handle this." Sam nodded. "All right, let's get to work." The following night, the group set out under the cover of darkness. The old warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted exterior bathed in the faint glow of a single floodlight. The Steel Vipers were inside, their voices carrying through the night as they joked and drank. Sly took the lead, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. He signaled to the others when the coast was clear, and they moved in silently, each man taking up a position around the building. John worked quickly, planting small charges on the gang's motorcycles. The explosives weren't designed to destroy. They'd disable the engines and create enough noise to cause chaos. Inside the warehouse, the gang was oblivious to the danger. Viper sat at a makeshift throne, barking orders to his crew. "You think that old man scared me?" he snarled. "He's nothing. Next time we see him, we burn his house to the ground." Sam heard the words from his position outside, his grip tightening on his rifle. He signaled to the team, and John detonated the charges. The explosions were deafening, the sound reverberating through the warehouse. The gang scrambled in confusion, their bikes smoking and sparking. Sam and his team moved in, their actions swift and coordinated. Smoke bombs filled the room, disorienting the gang further. By the time the dust settled, the Steel Vipers were subdued, their hideout in ruins. Viper, clutching his arm where he'd been grazed by a bullet, glared at Sam with pure hatred. "You think this is over?" he spat. Sam stepped closer, his expression cold. "It's over when I say it's over." Back in town, the veterans regrouped, their mission a success. The Steel Vipers had been broken, their leader humiliated, and their resources destroyed. As Sam sat on his porch that night, watching the sunrise, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was back where he belonged, on the front lines, fighting for something worth protecting. The steel vipers may have been subdued, but Sam knew better than to assume the fight was over. A gang like theirs didn't simply dissolve after one loss. If anything, their defeat at the warehouse would only stoke their thirst for revenge. Sam leaned on the porch railing, the morning breeze brushing his face, his thoughts heavy. The silence in the air felt too calm, too fragile. Inside the house, the rest of the team was scattered around the kitchen table, discussing their next moves. Big John leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "We sent them a message, all right, but Viper doesn't strike me as the type to let something like this slide." Sly nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the map spread across the table. "He'll regroup, and when he does, he won't make the same mistakes twice." Charlie, ever the optimist, sipped his coffee and shrugged. "Let him regroup. We've got the upper hand. They don't have bikes, they've lost supplies, and they know we're not messing around." Sam entered the room, his expression somber. "You're right, Charlie. They know we're serious, but that also means they'll come at us harder and dirtier. This isn't over." The room fell silent. The team had been through wars, both literal and figurative, but there was something different about this fight. It wasn't just about winning. It was about protecting a town that had all but given up hope. Sam's phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. He picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read the message. "What is it?" Carl asked, leaning forward. "Sheriff," Sam said, his voice grim. "Viper's been seen in town." The news was worse than Sam had feared. Viper and a handful of his remaining men had been spotted at the local bar, their presence a clear attempt to reassert dominance. The sheriff had sent the message more as a warning than a call for help. He knew he couldn't stand up to the gang alone. Sam and the team geared up quickly. While they didn't plan to start another fight outright, they couldn't ignore the situation either. As they piled into Big John's truck, the tension in the air was palpable. The bar was a dimly lit dive on the edge of town, its flickering neon sign casting eerie shadows on the gravel parking lot. Viper's motorcycle, one of the few that had survived the warehouse raid, was parked out front, its chrome gleaming under the pale light. Sam and his team stepped out of the truck, their boots crunching on the gravel. Inside, laughter and muffled conversation spilled out through the cracked windows. "I'll take point," Sam said, his voice low. The others nodded, falling into formation as they approached the entrance. Sam pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly. The bar fell silent as heads turned to see who had entered. Viper was seated at the far end of the room, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a cigar in the other. His men flanked him, their expressions dark and dangerous. Viper's eyes narrowed as he spotted Sam. Well, Viper drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "If it isn't Grandpa Hayes and his merry band of geriatrics." Sam didn't respond immediately. He stepped further into the room, his gaze locked on Viper. "You've done enough damage in this town. It's time you left." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The bar's patrons shifted uncomfortably, clearly not wanting to get involved. Viper smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You think you scare me, old man? You got lucky at the warehouse, but luck runs out." Sam's jaw tightened. "This isn't about luck. It's about doing what's right." Viper stood, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the room. "What's right?" he scoffed. "What's right is me and my boys taking what we want, and what we want is this town." Sam stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Not while I'm still breathing." For a moment it seemed like the situation would erupt into violence, but then one of Viper's men leaned in and whispered something in his ear. Whatever he said made Viper's smirk disappear, replaced by a scowl. "Enjoy your little victory while it lasts," Viper snarled, grabbing his jacket. "This isn't over." He stormed out, his men following close behind. The sound of their bikes roaring to life echoed through the night as they disappeared into the darkness. Sam exhaled slowly, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The team regrouped outside, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "What now?" Carl asked, his voice tinged with worry. Sam stared into the distance, his mind already working. "We prepare, because next time they won't hold back." The days that followed were a blur of activity. Sam and his team fortified the town, enlisting the help of a few brave locals who were tired of living in fear. They set up barricades, reinforced key buildings, and established communication networks using old field radios. Meanwhile, Viper was gathering his own forces. Word spread that he was calling in reinforcements from other chapters of the gang, turning the Steel Vipers into a small army. The town braced itself for what felt like an inevitable war. On the eve of the confrontation, Sam gathered his team at the diner. The mood was tense but resolute. "This is it," Sam said, his voice steady. "We've done everything we can to prepare. Tomorrow, we show them that this town isn't theirs to take." The team nodded, their faces set with determination. They had fought battles before, but this one felt different. This one was personal. As they left the diner and stepped into the cool night air, Sam looked up at the stars, his thoughts drifting to the men he had fought alongside all those years ago. "This one's for you," he whispered. The next morning, the Steel Vipers arrived in force. Their motorcycles roared down the main street like a thunderstorm, the sheer number of them sending a chill through the town. Viper led the pack, his face a mask of fury and determination. But as they reached the center of town, they were met with a sight that stopped them in their tracks. Barricades lined the streets, and behind them stood Sam and his team, armed and ready. The townsfolk had joined them, armed with whatever they could find: tools, pipes, even kitchen knives. Viper snarled, his hands tightening on his handlebars. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that." Sam stepped forward, his rifle resting across his shoulder. "This is your last chance, Viper. Turn around and leave, or face the consequences." The gang leader laughed, the sound harsh and cruel. "You think you can stop us? We'll burn this town to the ground." Sam's eyes hardened. "Then you'll have to go through me first." The battle for the town had begun. The roar of motorcycles filled the air as the Steel Vipers charged down the main street, their sheer numbers creating an intimidating sight. Viper led the pack, his face twisted into a snarling grin. Behind him, dozens of riders followed, their engines growling like wild beasts. On the other side of the barricades, Sam and his team stood their ground. The makeshift defenses might not have been much to look at, but they were strategically placed, creating choke points that forced the gang to funnel into narrow passages. "Hold your positions!" Sam barked, his voice carrying the authority of a seasoned leader. The townsfolk, scattered along the barricades, clutched their weapons tightly. For many of them, this was the first real fight of their lives. Fear was etched into their faces, but Sam's presence seemed to steady them. As the gang approached, the first trap was triggered. A tripwire strung across the road caught one of the riders, sending him sprawling as his bike skidded out of control. The crash caused a chain reaction, forcing several others to veer off course. "Now!" Sam shouted. John and Charlie sprang into action, tossing smoke bombs into the fray. The street erupted in chaos as thick plumes of smoke enveloped the bikers, disorienting them. The veterans moved with precision, their decades of experience shining through. Sam took up a position on the roof of a nearby building, his rifle trained on the advancing gang. He fired a warning shot, the bullet striking the ground inches from Viper's front wheel. Viper skidded to a halt, his face contorted with rage. "Get that old man!" he roared. Several bikers broke off from the main group, charging toward Sam's position, but they hadn't accounted for Sly, who emerged from the shadows with a well-placed swing of his bat, taking out the lead rider. "Thought you boys liked surprises," Sly quipped, disappearing into the smoke before they could react. Meanwhile, Big John manned a barricade, his massive frame a wall of determination. When one of the bikers tried to breach the defenses, John grabbed the man by his jacket and hurled him to the ground. "Not today, son," John growled, his voice a deep rumble. Carl stayed in the rear, tending to the wounded. A few townsfolk had taken minor hits, but Carl worked quickly, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. As the battle raged on, Viper grew more desperate. His gang was faltering, their numbers dwindling as Sam's team systematically dismantled their attack. But Viper wasn't ready to admit defeat. He revved his engine and charged straight through the barricade, his bike smashing through the wooden planks. He skidded to a stop in the middle of the street, his eyes locked on Sam. "Come down here and face me," Viper shouted, his voice echoing through the smoke-filled street. Sam climbed down from his position, his movements deliberate. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and walked toward Viper, his cane tapping against the pavement. The two men faced each other in the center of the street, the world around them seeming to pause. "You've done enough damage," Sam said, his voice calm but firm. "This ends now." Viper sneered. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just an old man clinging to a past that doesn't matter anymore." Sam's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe, but that old man is about to teach you a lesson." Viper lunged, swinging a chain toward Sam, but Sam sidestepped with surprising agility, his cane coming up to deflect the blow. He followed up with a sharp jab to Viper's knee, sending the gang leader stumbling. The fight was quick but brutal. Viper's strength was no match for Sam's precision and experience. Within moments, Sam had disarmed him, the chain clattering to the ground. Breathing heavily, Viper glared up at Sam from where he lay sprawled on the ground. "This isn't over," he growled. Sam stepped back, his cane still in hand. "It is for you. Get your men and leave. If I see you in this town again, you won't get another warning." Viper hesitated, his pride clearly warring with his survival instincts. Finally, he signaled to the remaining bikers, who helped him to his feet. "You'll regret this," Viper spat as he limped toward his bike. Sam didn't respond, his gaze steady as he watched the gang retreat. The aftermath of the battle was a mix of relief and exhaustion. The townsfolk emerged from their positions, their faces lighting up with cautious smiles as they realized the fight was over. Sam's team regrouped, their expressions a mixture of triumph and weariness. "Not bad for a bunch of old guys, huh?" John said, clapping Sam on the shoulder. Sam allowed himself a small smile. "Not bad at all." The victory wasn't just theirs, it belonged to the town. For the first time in years, the people felt a sense of pride and strength. They had stood up to their oppressors and won. As the sun began to set, Sam sat on his porch, the weight of the day settling over him. He knew the battle had been won, but the war wasn't over. The Steel Vipers might have retreated, but they weren't gone. Still, for now, the town was safe, and that was enough. The next morning, the town awoke to a quiet it hadn't felt in years. The Steel Vipers had been driven out, their defeat at the hands of Samuel Hayes and his team spreading like wildfire. For the first time, the townsfolk could walk the streets without fear of hearing the roar of motorcycles or the taunts of the gang. But Sam wasn't convinced it was over. He sat on his porch, his cane resting against the wooden railing as he scanned the horizon. The Steel Vipers were humiliated, but humiliation bred desperation, and desperate men were dangerous. Charlie approached, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Figured you'd need this," he said, handing one to Sam. "Thanks," Sam replied, taking a sip. "Anything from the Scouts?" Charlie shook his head. "Not yet. The Vipers didn't stick around. If they're planning something, they're doing it out of sight." "They'll be back," Sam said firmly. "Viper's too stubborn to let this go." Charlie nodded, his face hardening. "Then we make sure we're ready." Meanwhile, Viper sat in the dimly lit back room of an old auto shop miles outside town. His arm was wrapped in a bloodied bandage, a reminder of the fight he'd lost. Around him, the remaining members of the Steel Vipers stood in tense silence. "This isn't how it ends," Viper growled, slamming his fist on the table. "We're not running from a bunch of old men and farmers." One of his lieutenants, a wiry man nicknamed Snake, spoke up hesitantly. "Boss, they had the whole town backing them. Even with more men, it's going to be tough to take them head on." Viper's glare could have cut steel. "We don't take them head on, we make them suffer. Hit them where it hurts most." Snake hesitated before nodding. "All right, what's the plan?" Viper leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "We target the town itself. Their homes, their businesses. We burn it all down. And when they're too broken to fight back, we deal with Hayes and his crew." Back in town, Sam and his team wasted no time reinforcing their defenses. They set up patrols, enlisted more help from the townsfolk, and kept a constant watch on the roads leading in and out of town. Big John worked tirelessly in the barn, creating more traps and improvised defenses. "If they come back, they're walking into a hornet's nest," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. Sly, ever the strategist, had mapped out potential entry points the gang might use. "We need eyes on these spots at all times," he said, pointing to the map spread across the table. The townsfolk, inspired by Sam's leadership, rallied together. Families boarded up their homes, business owners reinforced their shops, and volunteers stood ready to defend their community. Despite the preparations, a sense of unease lingered. Sam could feel it in the air, the calm before the storm. The storm came 3 nights later. It started with a fire. The old grain mill on the edge of town went up in flames, the glow lighting up the night sky. The townsfolk scrambled to put it out, but the fire was a distraction. While the town's attention was on the mill, the Steel Vipers moved in. They came in smaller groups, attacking from multiple directions. Windows were smashed, cars were overturned, and fires were set in alleyways. But Sam and his team were ready. The first group of bikers was met with resistance at the barricades. Charlie and Big John held their ground, using the traps and defenses they'd set up to hold off the attackers. Smoke bombs and flashbangs disoriented the gang, giving the defenders the upper hand. At the center of town, Sam coordinated the response, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Move to the east barricade. Watch the alley on your left. Keep them contained." Sly moved through the shadows, taking out attackers with precision. His stealth and speed made him a ghost in the fight, striking and disappearing before the bikers could react. Viper, however, wasn't among the attackers. He stayed back, watching from a distance as his men carried out his orders. His eyes burned with anger, but there was something else there too: doubt. For all his bravado, Viper hadn't expected this level of resistance. The town wasn't breaking. If anything, the fight only seemed to strengthen their resolve. The battle raged on for hours, but by dawn it was clear who had won. The Steel Vipers, battered and broken, retreated once again, their numbers dwindling with each fight. Sam stood in the middle of the street, his rifle resting against his shoulder as he watched the last of the gang disappear into the distance. Around him, the townsfolk began to emerge, their faces tired but triumphant. "We did it," Charlie said, his voice heavy with relief. "For now," Sam replied. Back at the auto shop, Viper's remaining men gathered in tense silence. Their leader paced the room, his anger barely contained. "We're finished," Snake said quietly. "We've lost too many men. It's over." Viper spun on him, his eyes blazing. "It's not over until I say it is." But even as he spoke, the truth was undeniable. The Steel Vipers were done. Their reputation was shattered, their numbers decimated. And it was all because of one old man and his team. Viper slumped into a chair, his hands trembling with rage. For the first time he felt the weight of defeat. The town began to rebuild, their victory against the Steel Vipers becoming the stuff of local legend. Sam and his team were hailed as heroes, though they waved off the praise. "This wasn't about being heroes," Sam said one evening as he sat on his porch. "It was about standing up for what's right." The others nodded in agreement. They had fought battles before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about survival, it was about hope. As the sun set over the quiet town, Sam allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The fight was over, but the lessons it left behind would stay with the town forever. The days following the Steel Vipers' defeat were a blur of rebuilding and reflection. The town that had once cowered under the gang's rule now stood united, stronger than ever. Samuel Hayes sat on his porch, watching as neighbors worked together to repair the damage. Hammering nails, repainting walls, and clearing debris, they carried themselves with a newfound confidence. It wasn't the work of one man, Sam thought. It was the spirit of a community that refused to stay broken. Charlie joined him, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. "Thought you might need this," he said, settling into the chair beside Sam. Sam chuckled softly. "You're making a habit of this, Charlie. Starting to think you're buttering me up for something." "Maybe," Charlie replied with a grin, Or maybe I'm just enjoying the quiet for once." The quiet didn't last long. Big John's booming laugh echoed down the street as he helped a group of kids fix a bike that had been damaged during the fight. Sly stood nearby, leaning against a lamppost and offering instructions in his usual deadpan tone. "They're good men," Charlie said, nodding toward them. Sam smiled faintly. "The best. Couldn't have done this without them." Charlie sipped his coffee, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "So, what now? Think we'll ever see those bikers again?" Sam's expression darkened slightly. "Viper might try something, but I doubt he'll get far. He's lost too much. Men, bikes, his reputation. Even if he does come back, this town will be ready." Charlie nodded. "Damn right it will." That evening, the town held a gathering in the square. It wasn't exactly a celebration. There was still work to be done, but it was a chance to acknowledge what they had accomplished. The mayor, an older woman with a commanding presence, stood on the makeshift stage and addressed the crowd. "Tonight, we come together not just as a town, but as a family," she said, her voice steady and warm. "We've faced hardship and fear, but we stood tall, and we owe much of that to the men who led the charge." She gestured toward Sam and his team, who stood off to the side, trying to avoid the spotlight. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the buildings. Sam raised a hand in acknowledgement, his face tinged with embarrassment. "We didn't do this alone," he said. "This was a team effort. The whole town stood up and fought back. That's what made the difference." The mayor smiled. "Maybe so, but it takes courage to lead. And you, Mr. Hayes, have courage in spades." The applause grew louder, and for a moment, Sam let himself feel the weight of the recognition. He wasn't used to being a hero. He'd spent most of his life trying to leave the past behind. But now, standing in the glow of the town's gratitude, he realized something important. This fight hadn't just been about protecting the town. It had been about finding a purpose again. Months passed, and the scars of the battle began to fade. The barricades were taken down, the streets were cleaned, and the life returned to normal. But the lessons of that time lingered, shaping the town into something stronger. Sam sat on his porch, his cane resting against the railing. The morning sun bathed the street in golden light, and the air was filled with the hum of quiet activity. A young boy rode by on his bike, waving enthusiastically. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," he called. Sam waved back, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Morning, kid." Charlie walked up the steps, carrying a small package. "Mail came in," he said, handing it over. Sam opened it carefully, revealing a framed photo of his wartime unit. The edges were worn, but the faces were clear, their expressions frozen in time. Alongside the photo was a note. "To Sam, for reminding us all what it means to fight for something worth protecting." He set the frame on the table beside him, his eyes lingering on the faces of his old comrades. "You all right?" Charlie asked, his voice softer than usual. Sam nodded. "Yeah, I'm all right." The two men sat in companionable silence, watching the world go by. The town might not have been perfect, but it was theirs, and they had fought to keep it that way. As Sam sipped his coffee, a sense of peace washed over him. He had found his purpose again, not just as a protector, but as a part of something bigger. For the first time in years, Samuel Hayes felt like he was home. And just like that, Samuel Hayes proved that courage and resilience don't age. The town that once lived in fear found strength, and the Steel Vipers learned a hard lesson. Never underestimate a veteran who's willing to fight for what's right. Sam's leadership not only protected his community, but also inspired them to stand up for themselves. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes all it takes is one brave person to spark change. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder of the power of perseverance. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories that captivate and motivate. Drop a comment below and tell us, what's the most courageous thing you've ever witnessed? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.